Okay, good evening again. And I welcome all the PEMSA members and also my batchmates for joining us with this webinar of my batch with our PEMSA organized by the 8788 batch of medical graduates. Now, before we start, I would like to thank the PEMSA and its council for giving us the opportunity of organizing this webinar today. I'm very proud to be organizing it on behalf of the batch. And let me cordially invite our president of PEMSA, Professor Tushara Kudagamana, to talk to the audience before we start the webinar.
Thank you.
Over to you, Tushara.
Okay.
Yeah, stop share.
So, let me share my screen. Can you see my screen, Indu?
Yes.
Yeah, fine. Okay, right.
Yeah, we can.
So, good evening, everybody. Some of you might know me. I am Tushara Kudagamana, about 3 years junior to you all, right? And nice to see you, all of you. And let me welcome all of you on behalf of Peradeniya Medical School Alumni Association. So it was like a baby when you all were in the faculty, because PEMSA started in the year 1992. So now it has grown in stature, and it can be considered as the most powerful and widespread alumni association among the medical schools of the country. So we are 30 years old now, and we have many overseas chapters. So we have PEMSA UK is very active, and they have introduced so many activities on behalf of our alumni. And so is PEMSA Australasia, and they hold their biannual Congress. So most of us usually join. So on the right lower corner, you can see me being with two of former teachers. You might remember them, Dr. Nimi Aturli and Dr. Lekamge, were very active in PEMSA Australasia. So we also have chapters in Bhutan and USA as well. So we are international sort of organization now. So when it started PEMSA, it had its own objectives, and among them, one of them is to encourage, foster, and promote close relations between the school and its alumni. And this on this objective only we are having our my batch and our PEMSA webinar today. So this webinar is a brainchild of our previous president, Professor Vasanthi Pinto, who is the current dean. Now, since you were left the faculty has changed its landscape. You can see the entrance to the faculty, and on the lower side, you can see there are new structures coming up. Come up. It's called Nelumpokuna. I'm sure Indu will elaborate on this later on. And there's a new, big, huge building, the paraclinical block. So please come and visit us when you have time. As PEMSA, we have strived to make the environment as conducive as possible for the students' learning. As part of that, we have launched this faculty beautification program. I don't know whether you can identify this place. This is in between the dean's office building and the old biochemistry department. So this was, we have launched this program, and you can see it has become a beautiful place now with the new lawn laid up. So we'll be maintaining that by PEMSA. We also have changed the landscape in front of our clinical block. The block remain the same, but you can see the environment has become more conducive and pleasing to the eye. So, and also we have engaged many activities to, one thing is to improve the environment of the faculty, as also to improve the attachment of the students to the faculty. So we have got our staff also involved in most of these activities. You can see this pretty lady of your batch, Indu Nanakar, you can see planting a tree there. And the low one is Professor Tilak Jayalat, you all remember, and is very active and helping the faculty and the PEMSA in many ways. And we have made sure that there's so much of student engagement. And the right-hand side, you can see students initiated a Shramadana to clean up the faculty. And with all that, what we expect is for the attachment of the students to the faculty, which is an area that we thought is weak in our system. And you can see new places have come up, and we have PIMS had played a huge role in most of these. This is called Summit, we are dedicated for students, and we have tried to maintain its pristine appearance as much as possible with the help of the students and other alumni, help of other alumni. Please come and visit these places. Beautiful, so many beautiful areas now. So we have also activities for students by we have organized scholarships and bursaries. So this bursary scheme, I think, is a very important scheme we have organized now, where the students will receive 3,000 rupees a month from first year up to final year, and they'll be paying it back once they pass out. So I think it will give you the financial responsibility trained in the students as well. So we have helped the students during the crisis situation. Now this week, there's an unfortunate student who has lost both parents, one to COVID, other one to an accident. So PIMS have been coming forward to help them during this time. So we have organized textbook for books for students. So you can see the I think 81, 82 batch of Professor Jayalat and PIMS of UK organizing the first year's textbooks for this year. And we have also other activities like community projects and other donations. We have made raised donations for this university COVID center. So we have got highly involved in that. Then also we have been helping the students through PEMSA. There have been so many talented students. We have, so there are so many books that we have helped, PEMSA has helped for them to publish. So we have donated equipment, and also we have helped students who have won research awards, or have the opportunity to present at different places. We have been financially helping them. And also for the improvement of academic activities, we have organized these evening talks. We have continued for 2 months, 3 days a week. So very, very popular among students, especially during this trying period where they have a minimum of activities. And currently we have weekly case-based discussion, again, very popular among students, followed by MCQs. We also have had non-academic talks and webinars. You can see over the last 2-3 months, we had 2 of them organized, one on attire and etiquette for the smart professional, and then another for helping their education. So many activities we have been doing over the years. So now these are our alma mater, and which needs your help to sustain and prosper. I think as alumni, so most of you are now well-established medical professionals. So the faculty and PIMSA needs your help. So how can you help? So number one is join us. So joining and obtaining membership is very easy now. Just log into our website, www.pemsa.org.lk. So there is you can easily go to the membership app, and then you don't have to come there, come here, and you can fill up online application and make the online payment and become a member. So you can help us financially or other means. So you can help with this bursary scheme. But the bursary scheme, of course, is completely through alumni. So what the alumni does is alumni will agree to pay 3,000 rupees a month for or maybe a few years or 5 years if possible, and then we build up a fund so that in 5 years time, hopefully, if we can sustain this, you will not have to trouble the alumni over and over again. So hopefully we can sustain that by that. So you can help in other student academic activities. You can help in student research. There are so many of you with who have excelled in research, and you can help them. You can help the students and alumni in the career guidance. So you can help us in so many ways. So please do engage, and if you can log into our website, so you can give all the details for that. Right. So without taking much of your time, and let me thank Indu and Dr. Vasana Kiradena for organizing this on behalf of PEMSA, and also Sidus Cadilla helping with our website, the platform. Okay. All the best to you, and have a nice session, and good luck and all the best to you. Over to you, Indu.
Thank you, Tushara. Let me again share my screen. Okay, I was hoping that I could play the university anthem, but unfortunately the technical aspects could not be worked out. So we'll move on. Now when Tushara asked me to organize the seminar or webinar on my batch with PEMSA, I actually was in a bit of a dilemma, because we are out of the 124 medical graduates in our batch. We have about 25 consultants, and after 26 years of passing out, each of us have sort of gone to where we wanted to reach. So I could not select, it was a difficult task to select the speakers. However, I thought, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, it is best that we talked about COVID. And after having several discussions with the others, we arrived at a topic to talk about the list talked about aspects of COVID-19. So let me, before I start, so that's our batch of 87, 88 medical graduates. We met about 31 years ago, and this is actually a photo of our first batch trip taken at Haggala, and this is actually...
We can't see it, Indu. We can't see it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I've shared it. Okay, sorry.
I can. Now I
can you see? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Yes. Please let me know, because I am not aware that it's not visible. Yes. Now, so this is a photograph of the batch taken at the very first batch trip at Haggala, and this was taken at our 25th batch get together, 25th anniversary get together at Kurunegala. So I must also remember with them with sorrow, the 4 people who have left our batch at this moment. Now let me get on to the talk. We have 3 speakers today. Dr. Ruad Pereira, Dr. Mandula Bandaranaike, and Dr. Ashoka Wijayananda. The first speaker will be Dr. Ruad Pereira, and he will be talking about long-term effects of COVID-19. Ruad is a consultant respiratory physician. He holds a clinical teaching position at the University of Western Australia. He's an associate professor there, and he is also a respiratory physician working in the Royal Perth Hospital and the Western Australia TB Control Program. Dr. Pereira received his medical degree from the University of Peradeniya in 1995, and then trained in respiratory medicine at Teaching Hospital Kandy and Valisara Chest Hospital. He then joined the Royal Perth Hospital, where he completed his advanced training and obtained the fellowship of Royal College, Australian College of Physicians, as well as later Sri Lanka College of Physicians as respiratory physicians in 2009. He has a special interest in tuberculous and non-tuberculous mycobacterial diseases, bronchiectasis, pulmonary vasculitis, and interstitial lung diseases. He is also an active researcher in medical teaching and has many publications in local and international journals. He has also been a scientific reviewer for Respirology Medical Journal. Over to you, Ruad. Let me stop sharing and then you can start sharing your screen.
Can you hear me, Indu?
Yes, you can. Yeah, you need to share your screen, Ruad.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. Yeah. Can you see it?
Just a moment. All right. Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So thank you, Indu, for kind introduction, and also first of all, thanks for PEMSA as well inviting for this topic and talk about and share our knowledge. And also, I would like to be, I'm proud to be a graduate from Medical School Peradeniya. So this is the hospital where I work, Royal Perth Hospital. So I'll straight away go to the topic. Sorry, something. Right. So basically what I'm going to cover is that quickly cover current situation as an introduction for our three presentations. And thereafter, I'll go through briefly mortality and morbidity, long-term as well as short-term. And then I'll go into the topic, the post-COVID syndrome or lone hauler, so some people call. So basically, by September, end of September, there are 226 million confirmed cases around the world. Unfortunately, over 4 million deaths confirmed due to COVID. And if you look at the Sri Lankan figures, nearly 500,000 confirmed COVID cases, unfortunately, nearly 12,000 confirmed deaths. And if you look at the fatality rate or death rate, Sri Lanka in somewhat in between worst country compared to the better countries, about 2.3. India somehow better than us. I'm not sure whether because of underreporting. Nevertheless, it's an ongoing issue. So if you look at the global trend from 2019, you can see first wave was mostly affect the America and Europe countries. Thereafter, the first, second, third waves gradually spreading throughout the world, especially Delta variation affecting India and thereafter our part of the world. It's going to be, I think, it's going to be endemic rather than pandemic. So probably we need to live this in time to come, despite of vaccination. So going to the next topic, which is short term. What I'm going to talk about, first thing is talk about short term, because initially people thought the COVID is going to be like another influenza, mild illness, not to worry too much, so on. But with time what goes on, with what we saw was that it's not the case. We saw and more aggressive cases. So with that respect, I thought I'll select this particular published the cohort study, which was done by French group. And what they did was they compared the influenza pandemic in 2019 and 18 and to the COVID. So what they did was from the French National Administrative data, they selected nearly 90,000 COVID cases and compared with the 45,000 influenza cases to see if there's any difference. So this is a summary. So left, this is the COVID data. These are the influenza data. So you can see clearly there's a respiratory failure rate much higher, and it was significant. And then the pulmonary embolism as well as the blood clots are much higher and also significant. And if you look at the people need ventilation, intubation, also much higher. And the death, in-hospital death, as well as the in-hospital death among patients with ICU and also with the non-invasive ventilation was much higher compared to the previous influenza. It's clearly, it's a different disease, different morbidity and mortality. So having said that, then I thought we all know, probably, I'm not sure, we know that influenza and pneumonia cause significant increased risk of acute coronary syndrome as well as MI. There are enough data throughout the world to prove that. So if you look at this old study in 2004, NEJM published, can see if anyone got a pneumonia, especially older group over 50, first 3 days, there's a 5-time high risk of having acute myocardial infarction. And with time, it goes down, but there are enough evidence it can be sustained even 2-3 years, even 5 years. So even though we think it's just pneumonia, influenza, just simple disease, get better and you're fine, it's not the case. Same for the influenza. And also there are a couple of studies published that if you had a flu vaccine, which is equal to stop smoking in prevent of acute coronary syndrome. So in that respect, I thought, is it the COVID that's the same? So out of many publications, I select this Swedish study, and what they did was they compare the COVID cases, about 86,000 COVID cases, and compare with the match control to see whether there's any difference of acute coronary syndrome and ischemic stroke. So what they found was similar. So myocardial infarction within first week was 8 times more, and second week nearly 3 times more, and third and fourth week nearly 1.5 times more. Same for the ischemic stroke. So first week there's 6 times risk of ischemic stroke, and second week nearly 3 times, and so on. So the message is that even the COVID patients are get better, and you better think about these things time to come. They might present with acute myocardial infarction or acute coronary syndrome and ischemic stroke related to post-COVID sequelae. Sorry. So then the next topic is I'll go to brief summary of the evidence base of treatment for COVID. I know a lot of confusion about this around our colleagues everywhere in the world. Therefore, I'll briefly go through. Only 2 treatments had strong evidence for use. First one is dexamethasone. Unfortunately, it's a cheap drug, therefore misused around the world. There are good evidence from a randomized controlled trial, and especially from recovery trial. If you got a hypoxic patient, you can use it, but not for otherwise. And there's a strong recommendation to use the IL-6 receptor blockers like tocilizumab. So who are these severe and critical patients? According to WHO and some UK groups, severe mean saturation less than 90 and respiratory rate more than 30%. And if critical means if you need life-saving equipment like an intubation, NIV, or people with acute respiratory syndrome. So the next thing is that there are so many drugs being trialed to see whether this works. Unfortunately, none of these medication doesn't work at this stage. So first thing, one is azithromycin. There's a good systemic review published recently, shows there's no evidence of reduction in mortality or invasive mechanical ventilation. And ivermectin, I think, is a big how about this in Sri Lanka as well. There's no evidence so far from randomized controlled trial. In fact, there's more death from that than otherwise. And hydroxychloroquine and other antivirals, especially remdesivir, there's no benefit at all from reducing mortality or morbidity. Same for the doxycycline, anticoagulant, interferon, vitamin D, and colchicine. So then move to the long-term effect. So this is called long-term or long COVID syndrome. Unfortunately, largely unclear the incidence and prevalence, but current numbers and trends indicate that this is going to be a next public health disaster unless we have addressed earlier. So definition, there's no acceptable definition so far. Some people say 4 weeks to 8 weeks symptoms after the COVID infection, and without any other reason to explain the symptoms. And also there's shouldn't be any evidence of replicating virus. Epidemiology remains incompletely understood. And the incident vary from one study to another, depend on methodology. Some North American and European studies have reported the incident rate vary from 30 to 90% at 6 months. So most community or media talk about this as a new phenomenon, but this is not the case. We know that this before. The so-called chronic fatigue syndrome after post-viral, especially Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus, and post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, and chronic Epstein-Barr virus, and also Spanish flu in 1918 gave some neurasthenia as well as Parkinson-like syndrome. So therefore, some countries already have opened up some long COVID clinics to tackle this issue. Again, as you know, 10 to 70% of people can affect debilitating symptom after even 6 months or 1 year. Average age is about around 40. This is the prime age for working. So therefore, huge economic impact for most of the country because of sick leaves, lack of productivity, no acceptable objective diagnostics test or biomarkers. This is not due to blood clots, myocarditis, or multisystem inflammatory disease or pneumonia. I think multisystem disease was discussed by Asoka later on. You can talk about it a bit more. The causes of pathophysiology, we don't know. Some people believe chronic live virus ongoing infection. Some people believe it's autoimmune. Some people believe it's a sequelae of the inflammatory sequelae. So is there evidence for this? With that regard, I select a couple of papers because I can't discuss all the papers published, but I thought this is a couple of papers are more important. So this one published in Wuhan, what they did was they followed up inpatient after discharge, and nearly 1,733 was analyzed after 6 months. So this is the cohort. So basically they had 7 categories, 1 to 7. Scale 3 is hospitalized patient does not need oxygen. Scale 4 means you need oxygen, and scale 5 to 6 mean either need high flow or intubation. If you look at most of the patients managed by non-invasive ventilation, and most of them had steroid in severe group. So if you look at the outcome data at 6 months, you can see these are the symptoms they discover or they noticed. So at least, 76% people at least had one of the symptoms listed here. And out of that, fatigue and muscle weakness was the majority. So nearly 2/3 of people had some sort of fatigue and muscle weakness even after 6 months. And this was much higher in severe group. And sleeping difficulty in nearly 1/3 of the population. Hair loss, 22%. Smell disorder still was prevalence after 6 months even. And the palpitation, joint pain, and decreased appetite and taste were still prevalent, about 8 to 7% population. And dizziness, diarrhea, chest pain, skin rashes, myalgia, headache, and so on. These are in a lesser number. And then what they do, they go into a bit more and try to quantify the shortness of breath. They use what you call a modified Medical Research Council's questionnaire. So more than 1 mean patient find difficult shortness of breath on exertion, especially on incline. So nearly 1/3 of the people had some sort of shortness of breath. And also pain and discomfort on body in nearly 1/3 of the population. And alarmingly, 1/3 of the population after 6 months had depression or anxiety. And they did a 6-minute walk test, and again, they found about nearly 1/3 of the population had abnormal 6-minute walk test. So clearly, people are having some sort of disability even after 6 months. So this is another called forest plot. So you can see if you have a high scale, they had a higher diffusion impairment, which is a lung function impairment, and also abnormal CT scan, much worse in severe cases, as well as anxiety and depression was much higher in severe group. So these are the findings they found, mostly ground glass opacities. We call this is ground glass, like a hazy patches, and some had some streaky fibrotic scarring. And if you look at the figures, numbers, half of them had ground glass opacification of the CT scan even after 6 months, and some had some scarring. So in summary, 76% had at least one of the symptoms. Most common report symptoms were fatigue and muscle weakness. And then 1/3 had sleeping difficulties, nearly 1/3 had anxiety and depression. In subgroup analysis, they had abnormal 6-minute walk test in 1/3. and the abnormal diffusion capacity in 80%, and abnormal CT chest in half of the population, mainly ground glass of investigation. And interestingly, CT changes wasn't associated with severity of the disease. Even the mild patient had abnormal severity as the severe people. So the next paper I selected in a non-hospitalized patient, previous one hospitalized patient. This is German study. What they did was they followed up non-hospitalized patient, about 1,000 patients for 7 months. Most of them had either cannot smell or cannot taste, and fatigue and shortness of breath at the 4th and 7th month. Nearly 2/3 of people had some sort of abnormality. And some of the factors were shown that increased risk of getting post-COVID syndrome. These are the multiple symptoms at diagnosis: diarrhea, loss of taste or smell, and if they had a baseline high IG levels, shown to have a high risk of getting post-COVID syndrome. And the male gender was actually the lower risk of post-COVID syndrome, like chronic fatigue syndrome for other diseases as well. So that's what they say. If you have a higher immunoglobulin levels, and then you have more risk of having these symptoms. So then I thought, does it happen everywhere in the world? So therefore, I select few studies published in different countries. So Italy, again, similar symptoms. Nearly 2/3 had some sort of symptoms. Fatigue was the common, and dyspnea in nearly half of the population. Joint pain, 1/3 the population. Say again for the Belgium study, nearly quarter had dyspnea, and 35% had fatigue, and half of them had abnormal diffusion capacity, which is the lung function abnormality, and 1/3 had abnormal CT. Again, they also show the discrepancy between the severity of the disease from the CT scan abnormality. Again, the last one, the Norwegian study, same. 2/3 people had either dyspnea or limitation in daily activities after a 3 months, abnormal lung function test, and CT abnormalities. Another CT follow-up 4 months with a CT scan, similar picture. 20% CT were abnormal in non-mechanically ventilated persons, and 72 people who had a mechanical ventilation. Longer duration of intubation was associated with more lung fibrosis, which is, I think, well known. So these are some of the pictures from the data. You can see fibrotic streaky shadows versus the ground glass opacities. So in summary, dyspnea and fatigue was the most common. Nearly 2/3 of the population had this, even after 6-7 months. And CT wave changes were abnormal, even half of the population. And anosmia, nearly 10%, and anxiety, depression, nearly 1/3 of the population, which is a bit alarming. So management-wise, unfortunately, still we don't know, because we don't know the pathophysiology, we don't know how to diagnose it first. Therefore, there's no direct treatment for this. I think most bodies believe this has to be multidisciplinary, as already we do for chronic fatigue syndrome. Psychotherapy, psychiatrist involvement, rehabilitation, group therapy, so on. We need to understand it's going to be a huge impact for mental disorder. Already we got this, and there's additional load for this. We know that 1/3 of the population develop some sort of anxiety, depression, and chronic fatigue syndrome going to be a huge problem. Lung fibrosis, there are some trials going for this, for antifibrotics, still too early to tell this. So finally, challenge ahead for us in Sri Lanka, even throughout the world, is this issue, especially the chronic fatigue syndrome and the depression. Just I calculate according to the numbers, what we got 500,000 cases at this stage. If you calculate depression, anxiety, we expect additional caseload of 150,000 patients. And if you look at the fatigue and reduced exercise tolerance, there's going to be another 300,000 patients will come to us in future with these symptoms. I believe in Sri Lanka, these numbers should be much, much higher, because there will be undiagnosed cases at this stage. So there's going to be a real impact on our workforce, economy, and productivity, and also our mental health. I think we should be very aware of this and try to handle. And early diagnosis is very important. Then I think we can address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruad, for that good summary of all the evidence and providing us with all the case reports and everything. So we will move, we will have the questions at the end of the talk, and I will move on to the next speaker. Okay, so the next topic is on rhino-orbitocerebral mucormycosis. And to talk about this, I have invited Dr. Bandula Bandaranaike, consultant ENT surgeon at the Sirimao Bandaranaike Specialized Children's Hospital. Bandula graduated with me in 1995 and started his local ENT training in the Kandy Hospital. Then he proceeded to UK and was trained at Queen Elizabeth's Hospital, Kings Lynn, and then later on at James Paget University Hospital, Norfolk, UK. Following his return to the country, he has worked at Polonnaruwa, Kayagalla, Baathale district hospitals and also Kurunegala Teaching Hospital. He is at present the consultant ENT surgeon at SBSCH, and he is also an examiner for the PGIM postgraduate examinations. Over to you, Bandula.
Thank you very much, Indu. And
let me stop here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. Okay, good evening, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. And same time, I would like to thank PEMSA and giving this opportunity to share my knowledge about this deadly opportunistic infection, black fungus. It's an endemic within the pandemic. I'm not going to discuss very detailed, and this is just an overview to make you aware about the problem. Mucormycosis is an angioinvasive disease. It's caused by infection with fungi belonging to the group of Mycorrhizae. Rhizopus species are the most common causative organism of this group. It is a rare disease and difficult to diagnose disease, and progression is very rapid. Because due to rarity and rapid progression, diagnosis is often delayed and associated with high morbidity and mortality. Patient population is diabetic is traditionally the major risk factor, but in recent past, malignancy with chemo and immunotherapy patients and patients with organ transplantation also included into this group. Clinical manifestation, apparently fungus can affect any organ. The main route of infection seems to be inhalation. Inoculation and ingestion also possible. And cutaneous and soft tissue involvement common in immunocompetent patients. Pulmonary infection common in neutropenic patients, and rhino-orbital infection with cerebral involvement typically present in patients with diabetes mellitus. Gastrointestinal mucormycosis is rare and with high mortality and usually present or affect neonates. Actually, what happened in India in March 2021. At that time, their percentage of immunization was less than 3%, but number of COVID-19 patients count gradually reducing. And they have falsely believed that they are almost reaching for herd immunity. So the authorities opened up the country and people were relaxed, and therefore huge gathering for religious festival and sport events. Because due to this mutation of virus, there was a sudden and rapid surge of number of new cases as well as death, and country went into a chaotic situation. What we saw in media, the people were searching and collecting oxygen cylinders, but what we didn't see is that empirical use of steroid and antibiotic, which were issued over the counter. The result was this. I said this is a rare disease, but compared to the world, prevalence is 80 times higher in India. That may be due to large population of diabetes mellitus. India reported over 40,000 cases of black fungus during last 3 months, with over 4,000 deaths. If you take mucormycosis and COVID-19, and 80% of the cases were reported in India. In addition to that, there were some reported cases in Middle East, Egypt, and Latin America. Now, in the last 2-3 weeks, now we also see patients, apparently 1 or 2 patients per day. 80% of them are male, and 80% cases were having diabetes mellitus and also treated with steroid. Main involved area is nose and sinus, so head and neck. 50 to 60% cerebral involvement were there, where mortality is very high, over 90%. Otherwise, overall mortality is over 50. So what facilitates mucormycosis supposed to germinate in COVID patients? Because even in India, there were large population of diabetes and they were treated with steroid, but didn't have this sort of problem. So why this is with COVID? Problem is most probably the low oxygen or hypoxia and high blood glucose level due to diabetes as well as steroid therapy and acidic medium and high free iron is the situation that make fungus to grow rapidly. In addition to that, the prolonged hospitalization with or without ventilation and unhygienic hospital setup using dirty cylinders and tube for oxygen therapy. This is actually divided opinion, and some people argue against that, saying that the anyway hospital in India is dirty. But repeated use of unhygienic mask also blame. The link with diabetic and role of steroid is that when presence of diabetes mellitus with or without diabetic ketoacidosis increases the severity of COVID-19 and risk of contracting mucormycosis. Use of steroid make hyperglycemia and precipitate ketoacidosis. Use of steroid reduce phagocytic activity of white cell and cause impairment of bronchoalveolar macrophage migration, ingestion, and phagolysosome fusion. And low pH is fertile media for fungus. The free iron was an ideal resource for mucormycosis. Hyperglycemia reduced the iron binding by glycosylation of transferrin and ferritin, allowing increased free iron. Acidosis and elevated cytokine due to COVID-19 increase free iron by increased synthesis of ferritin and decreased iron transport. COVID-19 itself caused endothelialitis, endothelial damage, thrombosis, leukopenia, and reduction of CD4 and CD8 T cells, and thus predisposed to opportunistic infection. Presentation. The usually patient present who are recovering from COVID-19 or 1 or 2 weeks after discharge from the hospital. The usual presentation is headache, orbital pain, and retroorbital pain, and dry nose. They may have systemic symptoms like fever and lethargy. 1 or 2 weeks after COVID-19, anyway, we will reassure them and send home. So you can miss the patient. But because due to this is angioinnocent disease and necrosis of the mucosa can cause black color nasal discharge. The disease is apparent when it spread beyond the nose and sinuses. When it spread above, the orbit is there. When the orbit is null, the eye become red, can have periorbital swelling, proptosis, and ophthalmoplegia when in all the muscles in the orbit and loss of vision. You can have multiple cranial nerve palsies when infection spread into the cavernous sinus, and through that easily it can spread into the brain. In addition to that, it can spread into the facial or soft tissue as well as hard palate, and also present into dental problem, present as dental problem like loose teeth, numbness of teeth. You can have a skin necrosis, we call it a scar formation. The diagnosis, generally easiest way is using a rigid nasal endoscope and have a look inside the nose. You need to maintain high index of suspicious because prognosis depends on the early diagnosis. You can see mucosa in pale color due to ischemia and black in color due to subsequent necrosis. When you have a look inside the nose, take a small biopsy for fungal study and histology. Fungal study, you need to send the sample urgently, urgent transport to MRI with a plain bottle for culture and further identification of the fungus. Histologically, you can, I don't go into the details, it's a ribbon-like hyphae in irregular pattern with absent or septate or very minimum septate. You may see the vessel occlusion. Imaging is very helpful and easily diagnosed once disease spread beyond the sinus and nose. When it confined to the sinus space, we miss the diagnosis. Probably we think that we can't differentiate it with usual sinusitis. CT scan is available most of the hospital now. Contrast CT helpful to identify the orbital and cerebral invasion. Unilateral mucosal thickening, infiltration of periantral fat planes or fat stranding is an early sign of infiltration, and bone erosion, air fluid level in the sinuses, and obstruction to the osteomeatal complex, which is a common opening area for maxillary and ethmoidal sinuses. MRI can diagnose orbital and brain involvement, and contrast will not reach the necrotic tissue due to lack of blood supply. Therefore, they will appear as black areas. The management-wise, immediate involvement of multidisciplinary team with medical, surgical, OMF, radiology, and laboratory specialties. Transfer the patient to a center where facilities are available and try to adhere to the available guideline. It is readily available in the internet. Management is surgical as well as medical. Surgical management involves removal of all the infected tissue inside the nose and sinuses to an early endoscopic complete debridement until normal looking tissue, that means breathing tissue, and may need repeated surgeries. When it spread beyond the limit of sinuses. Then you have in the orbit, you have to remove the orbital acceleration and advance endoscopic approach to the base of the skull, including cavernous sinus. When the maxilla is involved, maxillectomy and extensive subtissue debridement in the face. Medical management is antifungal drugs. Usually we use single drugs, and IV liposomal amphotericin is the drug of choice. Dose is 5 to 10 mg/kg per body weight per day. Limitation is the renal toxicity and the cost. It is a very expensive drug. The treatment duration is unknown, and it is personalized decision until complete response from imaging or permanent reversal of immunocompromised situation. All other licensed drugs like amphotericin B, isaconazole, posaconazole are second-line drugs. And this is the guideline and doses, and I'm not go through each and every box. And treatment failure. It is common due to refractory mycosis or drug toxicity. Renal and hepatic toxicity is the main problem, and it is very common due to previous organ damage because most of them are diabetes, maybe diabetic nephropathy, and also renal transplant patients like that. So need to check serum creatinine and electrolyte daily, and you have to maintain fluid balance chart. And in case of toxicity, you can use alternative drug. Management summary. Actually, I took this Ceylon Journal of Otolaryngology and Head and Neck Surgeon, and this is a study, from Dr. Daminder from Anuradhapura Hospital, and it has nicely summarized everything. And urgent CT and RNA is necessary, and aggressive surgical debridement and send sample for direct smear, culture, and histology, and start IV liposomal amphotericin B, and hydrate with 250 ml of normal saline before and after IV amphotericin, and combine with IV ceftazidime or relevant antibiotic, and baseline renal function and liver function necessary, and daily serum creatinine and serum electrolyte, CRP, full blood count, serum magnesium, serum calcium, blood urea in every day, and serum phosphate in every 5th day. Correct electrolyte abnormalities accordingly, and repeat investigation more frequently if they are abnormal. Maintain daily input-output chart. When serum creatinine level double, amphotericin is usually withheld until it becomes to baseline value. Maintain tight glycemic control, frequent rigid nasal endoscopy, and debridement of necrotic tissue, and local packing with amphotericin B packs every 3rd day. Coming to the summary, so what I want to tell that is early diagnosis with high index of suspicious. Diagnosis is clinically, radiologically, and laboratory. And early and aggressive debridement to reduce the fungal load, and treat with drug of choice is liposomal amphotericin. Fluid and electrolyte balance with other supportive measures is very important, and you follow up with repeated endoscopy and repeated surgery, and also repeated radiological assessment with CT scan. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Bandula. We will move on to the next speaker now. Bandula, if you can stop sharing, I can.
Yeah. Give me 1 minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So the next speaker is going to be Dr. Ashoka Vijayananda. He's going to talk about multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. He is a consultant anesthesiologist and intensivist working currently at Sirima Bandaranaike Specialized Children's Hospital at Peradeniya. After having completed his local anesthesiology training at Kandy and National Hospital Colombo, he has obtained his postgraduate training at Basildon and Thurrock University Hospital, Essex, UK. And following return to the island, he has served at Mannar and Matale district hospitals before taking over his position at the SBSCH at Peradeniya. So over to you, Ashoka. Ashoka?
Okay.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Can you all see my screen?
Yes. Yes. Right. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. It is currently a very important topic. So first, I will be starting with two cases that we have managed in our hospital. So first one is a 10-year-old child transferred from Gampala Hospital with a history of high-grade fever and productive cough for 5 days, vomiting, loose stools, and conjunctival hemorrhage for about 2 days. And this child had a contact history for COVID-19 infection. And on admission, the child was severely ill. He was almost collapsed, and they resuscitated. Then he was transferred to our hospital. And this patient's rapid antigen test was negative, and PCR was positive with a high CT value, and the antibodies to COVID-19 also was positive. So this child also had almost all the systems involved, and all the inflammatory markers were elevated, and liver functions and renal function tests were marginally elevated, and the hemoglobin and platelet count was low. The ET secretions for culture was positive for Acinetobacter, but all the other cultures were negative. And he had a normal echo study. The chest X-ray showed consolidation and effusion on right side of the lung. So this was the first one was the X-ray taken just before intubation. And the second one was while on the ventilator on the 3rd day. And the third one was just before extubation. So this child was diagnosed to have a multi-system inflammatory syndrome. The second case is an 8-year-old girl presented with a history of high-grade fever, vomiting, and severe abdominal pain for 3 days duration. This child was previously well, and there was no history of exposure to COVID-19. Her rapid antigen test was negative. Full blood count came as neutrophilia, and CRP was very high in this patient, and ultrasound abdomen came as inflamed appendix. So on the same day, we had to operate on this patient. So it was a laparoscopic surgery under general anesthesia, and found to the appendix found to be normal, but there was inflammation of the whole bowel. So next day she developed a rash, and the hands were swollen and red. In this child, the PCR was negative, but the COVID antibodies were positive. So all the inflammatory markers were elevated in this child as well. But her troponin I was negative. The chest X-ray was normal in this patient, but the echocardiogram showed dilatation of coronary arteries. So this child was also diagnosed as multi-system inflammatory syndrome, and she was sent home with a follow-up plan after managing in the ward. So what is this multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children? So it's a rare severe hyperinflammatory syndrome in children and adolescents. Usually they present about 6 weeks after COVID-19 infection. So this was first reported in United Kingdom in association with COVID-19 infection. So actually it came as a case series. They presented a case series of 8 children who presented similar features to Kawasaki's disease and toxic shock syndrome. Earlier, they thought it is Kawasaki's disease, but later on, they realized that it is not Kawasaki and it is a separate entity. And after that, from various parts of the world, there were similar case reports coming up with similar conditions. And on 14th May last year, Center for Disease Control and Prevention in America, they published a case definition for this condition, and they advised to report all the cases. So according to their study, the mortality was around 2%. So what is this case definition? So this is the CDC case definition. So for them to diagnose MIS-C, so age of the patient should be less than 21 years, and there should be fever more than 38 degrees for more than 24 hours. And patient should be clinically severe disease requiring hospitalization with 2 or more organ involvement has to be there. That is cardiac, renal, respiratory, hematological, gastrointestinal, dermatological, and neurological. Out of these, at least 2 should be involved. And also he should have elevated markers of inflammation, and there should be no other diagnosis. And also he should have positive for current or recent COVID infection. This could be positive PCR, positive rapid antigen test, or positive serology, or at least exposure to COVID-19 infection within the last 4 weeks. So this is a study done in US, and it was published in New England Journal of Medicine. And it was a surveillance done somewhere in March last year. So the study duration was from 15th March to 20th May. And they asked all the pediatric health centers across the USA to submit all the cases which was diagnosed as MIS-C. The case definition they used were according to the CDC case definition, which I was described. So according to their surveillance study, they got hold of 186 patients with MIS-C, and their median age was 8.3 years, and 62% were males, and about 73% were previously healthy, and PCR or antibody positive in 70% of the patients, and out of these patients, 88 were hospitalized. So these are the systems involved. Gastrointestinal system was involved in about 92% of the patients, and other systems like cardiovascular 80%, hematologic 76%, mucocutaneous 74%, and respiratory 70%. So their median duration of hospitalization was 7 days. Then the most important thing is about 80% needed ICU care, and 20% needed mechanical ventilation, and about 48% needed some sort of vasoactive support. According to the study, 4 died, so the mortality is around 2%. So coronary arteries were dilated, the coronary dilation and aneurysm were found in 8% of the patient, and Kawasaki-like disease were found in about 74% of the patients, and 92 had elevated biomarkers. At least 4 biomarkers of inflammation were elevated. So therapy used was the immunomodulating therapy. So they have used intravenous immunoglobulin and glucocorticoids, and also the interleukin-6 inhibitors like tocilizumab. So this is an interesting graph. If you go through this bottom one, you can see the yellow line. It shows the number of percentage positive cases for COVID-19 infection, and the red one shows the number of cases with multi-system inflammatory syndrome over the study period. So you can clearly see with time the number of positive cases are increasing, and it has come to a peak around somewhere around April 10th, and then the cases started declining. So, but the number of cases with multi-system inflammatory syndrome keeps on rising. So the most important thing here is, now we are in Sri Lanka, we are at a state our numbers are coming down, but in the society, we have the diagnosed cases somewhere around 500,000. We also experience the number of missing cases coming to the hospitals are increasing in numbers, right? So time to come, there will be more and more cases. And according to this study, about 80% needed ICU care. So we have to be prepared to treat these patients, and we know that with time the numbers will be increasing, because it starts about 4 to 6 weeks for them to start the disease. So even the number of patients with COVID-19 are low at the moment. Within the next 2 to 6 weeks, number of missing cases will be high in the country. So this is also from another study. You can see the blue line shows the adult and children who are positive for COVID-19, and the red one shows the number of missing cases, which is rising with time. So when it comes to epidemiology, the incidence is uncertain, and it's a rare complication of COVID-19 infection, which is about less than 1% of confirmed COVID infection. And most cases are found in older children and adolescents who were previously healthy. And common age group is 8 to 11 years. And they usually present 2 to 6 weeks after the acute COVID infection. So pathophysiology is also not well understood. Many affected children will have a negative PCR, but they will be positive for serology. It is suggested that this syndrome results from an abnormal immune response to the COVID virus. So there are some clinical similarities to Kawasaki's disease, macrophage activation syndrome. All those conditions are immune-mediated conditions. So exact triggering factor of the virus is still unknown, and the mechanism of myocardial injury is also not well understood. So these are the clinical manifestations. Usually the onset is 2 to 6 weeks after acute infection, and they will have fever, mucocutaneous symptoms like bulbar conjunctivitis and rashes, and they will have myalgia and also swollen hands and feet. They also can have cervical lymphadenopathy. Gastrointestinal symptoms are the commonest presentation, and cardiovascular symptoms are also common. Respiratory symptoms are not that common in this condition. And they also can have pericardial effusion, pleural effusion, and ascites. And acute kidney injury, they can have an acute kidney injury, but that is not that severe. According to an Italian study, in their study, the fair number of children had acute kidney injury, but none of them needed renal replacement therapy. And other presentation is with neurological symptoms. They can have headache, drowsiness, and seizures, and encephalopathy-like features also these children can present. So these are the laboratory investigations and findings. So if you do a full blood count, you can see high neutrophil count and low lymphocyte count and anemia and thrombocytopenia. So elevated inflammatory markers, usually the CRP, ESR, D-dimers, fibrinogen, ferritin, and procalcitonin levels will be high. And they will have low albumin levels, and liver enzymes will be mildly elevated, and LDH also can be elevated. Triglyceride will be low, and cardiac markers like troponin I, BNP, or N-terminal BNP will be high. So other investigations are echo findings. Echo will show depressed LV function, coronary artery abnormalities like dilatation and aneurysm, and also they can have pericardial effusion and a mitral regurgitation. ECG will show you non-specific changes, ST changes or T-wave abnormalities, and they also can have arrhythmias and heart blocks. Chest X-ray, many will have a normal chest X-ray, but they still can have a pleural effusion or patchy consolidation and they can have a patchy consolidation and a pleural effusion in the chest X-rays. So other investigations are testing for COVID infection. They can have a positive rapid antigen test or positive PCR, and also positive serology. And also you have to exclude other infections. You need to do blood cultures, urine cultures, throat cultures, nasopharyngeal swabs. And also you should exclude Epstein-Barr virus infection and enterovirus and adenoviral infections. So these are the differential diagnoses. There is Kawasaki's disease, acute COVID infection, bacterial sepsis, toxic shock syndrome, appendicitis, other viral and bacterial infections, and SLE. So how do you diagnose this condition? So earlier I told you that there were CDC case definition, that is the American one, and also the WHO and the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health from UK also came with different case definitions. As we are following this WHO case definition, we diagnose patients according to this. So according to the WHO case definition, the children and adolescent, the age is from 0 to 19 years. In American one, it was less than 21 years, if you can remember. And the other thing is they should have fever more than 3 days. And they should have at least 2 of the following conditions. First one is rash or bilateral non-polyurethral conjunctivitis or mucocutaneous inflammation. And the second one is hypotension or shock. And third one is features of myocardial dysfunction, pericarditis, valvulitis, or coronary abnormalities. And the next one is evidence of coagulopathy and the acute gastrointestinal problems. Out of these 5, at least you should have 2 for the diagnosis. And also they should have elevated markers of inflammation, and there should be no other obvious cause of inflammation, and there should be evidence of COVID-19 infection. This can be a positive rapid antigen test or a positive PCR or positive serology, or at least the exposure to COVID-19 infection during the last 4 weeks. So how do you manage these patients? So depending on the patient's severity, you will decide where this patient is going to be managed. So if they are critically ill, or if they need ventilation or inotropic support, they will go to the ICU. And less severe cases, you can manage in the wards. So whether to isolate or not to isolate will depend on the CT value of the PCR. And all the patients you have to give aspirin. So dose is 3 to 5 milligram per kg daily for a minimum of 4 weeks, and you have to continue until the platelet counts become normal and the coronary arteries become normal. The other drug is the intravenous immunoglobulin. It is recommended for all the patients. It is given as a single dose, 2 grams per kilogram body weight over 8 to 12 hours. So in refractory cases, you can consider a second dose of IVIG. Antibiotics, you should commence antibiotics within the first hour. Suggested antibiotic combinations are ceftriaxone and vancomycin. And the other combination is flucloxacillin or teicoplanin with piptaz in children who is having acute kidney injury. Or you can add clindamycin if they are having features of toxin-mediated illness. The other important drug is glucocorticoids. In less severe cases, it is used as a second line of treatment. The first line of treatment will be IVIG, and as the second line, you can use corticosteroids. So in moderate or severe disease, you give it with intravenous immunoglobulin. So the drug we use is IV methylprednisolone, 2 milligram per kg, 2 divided doses for 3 to 5 days. In life-threatening conditions, you can use as a pulse therapy, 20 to 30 milligram per kg per dose for 3 to 5 days. And once improved, you have to change it to oral prednisolone 2 milligram per kg per day. And this is reduced by 25% per week over the next 4 weeks. Enoxaparin. Yeah, these patients with MIS-C are at a risk of thrombotic complications. And if the patient's cardiac, if there are cardiac involvement, they can have left ventricular thrombus, and there is a risk of myocardial infarction as well. So, and COVID-19 related MIS-C itself can cause DVT and pulmonary embolism. Therefore, you have to start enoxaparin in these patients. Whether to start a therapeutic dose or a prophylactic dose will depend on the severity of the patient and the other clinical manifestations. So if they are more prone to get venous thromboembolism, or if they're having left ventricular dysfunction, if the patient is treating in the ICU, if the D-dimer levels are high, you have to start a therapeutic dose. And in mild cases, you can go for a prophylactic dose. Inotropes. Yeah, some children, they present with vasodilatory shock, which is refractory to fluid expander. So then you need to start an inotrope. So as you all know, in septic shock, the first line of inotrope is the noradrenaline, but here we use adrenaline as the first line of inotrope because these children may have left ventricular dysfunction. So in severe LV dysfunction, we use milrinone and dobutamine as well. So in refractory cases, you can start a second dose of immunoglobulin or a pulse dose of methylprednisolone. So these drugs also have been used, but their use is uncertain. The antiviral drugs and interleukin-1 inhibitors, interleukin-6 inhibitors, and convalescent plasma from recovered COVID-19 patients. So this is from an American College of Rheumatology. It's a clinical guideline. So if you get a patient, who's diagnosed to have MIS-C, and if they are having a organ-threatening condition, you have to start IVIG 2 grams per kg And at the same time, you can start methylprednisolone IV 1 to 2 milligram per kg dose. So if they are not responding to that, then as a second line, you can start the pulse therapy of methylprednisolone. If they are not that ill, you can start as the first line of drug as the IV intravenous immunoglobulin, and in refractory cases, you can go for a methylprednisolone 1 to 2 milligram per kg dose. So these patients, you need to have a follow-up. So you need to monitor their inflammatory markers, and when considering the ESR is not that useful after giving a lot of intravenous immunoglobulin. So troponin I, it will take 14 days to normalize, but when there's a clinical indication, you need to do the troponin I levels. So the most important thing is in the follow-up study is the echocardiogram. So you need to do echocardiograms in 1 to 2 weeks in patients who initially had a normal heart and coronaries. In patients with coronary artery dilatation or aneurysms, you have to do echocardiograms in every 2 to 3 days until the coronary artery size is stable. And thereafter, you have to continue it in 1 to 2 weeks for the next 4 to 6 weeks. So patients with systolic dysfunction and with a normal coronary artery on the initial echo, so as clinically indicated, you need to repeat the echocardiogram. And patients who had coronary artery involvement or systolic dysfunction in the acute phase, you need to do cardiac MRI in 2 to 6 weeks time to assess the ventricular function and to see the evidence of edema, diffuse fibrosis, or whether there are scars or not. So aspirin, you should continue aspirin for 4 weeks or until the platelet counts become normal or the coronary arteries become normal. Enoxaparin you should continue maybe the therapeutic or prophylactic dose until the D-dimer levels are normal. So these patients, long-term follow-up and further studies are needed because these patients with treatment, they recover very quickly, but we don't know the exact long-term effects that they can carry. And are these children prone to develop similar symptoms in future with another coronavirus infection or with other viral infections? And is it safe for them to receive a COVID-19 vaccine? Or if so, what vaccine are we going to use? So are there any genetic predisposition that makes people more susceptible to MIS-C conditions? So these things are not answered yet, but further studies will come with answers. So that is it from me. Thank you very much for listening for this presentation.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashoka. Thank you very much for that very detailed account of the MIS-C infection. Now we have about 5 to 10 minutes for some questions. I see a couple of questions in the chat box. If the panelists can please put your mics on, I think it would be good. Yeah, there is a question directed to Ruad, and it says, are there any data comparisons between immunized and non-immunized patients?
For my knowledge, I don't know, but I can predict is that because when the FDA approved for vaccines, because I did some, initial talks, we want to talk about vaccine and side effects, but I don't think, first thing is we don't have the long history post-vaccine to do some studies to see what's the effect after the post-vaccine syndromes. But my understanding that is, if at all, it has to be very, very low compared to the COVID. But unfortunately, I don't know.
Okay. There's another question also on similar lines, a comparison between vaccinated and not vaccinated groups. People have asked.
But I think it should be much, much lower. According to what I've read it in the FDA and other data, vaccine, because they don't approve. If you have a long-term sequelae like depression and all these things, I don't think no one will approve the vaccine to give it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, thank you, Arwan. There is another question here about post-viral fungal infections. Post-viral fungal infections, any association with smoking, betel chewing, probably, is there an association? I think it's directed to Bandula.
Apparently, we don't know the reason, but we know that it's immunocompromised people were affected. But it's obvious that it's if you, smoking alcohol doesn't do that much immunocompromise until they go into malignancy situation and surgery and immunotherapy, like and chemotherapy. So otherwise, India actually, the recent endemic, there is no evidence actually, even count also not properly taken. But in fungal infection is no, I don't think that I haven't come across that sort of a evidence.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. I was not aware of this actually. I have to ask these CIDES people. Now the participants are not able to join in questions. They are muted. Shukri, hello? Yeah, Shukri. Yes, the participants are not able to ask questions, isn't it? They can't join in.
Actually, they can ask in the chat box, ma'am.
Ah, right. Okay. Other than that, they can't ask questions verbally, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not allowed. Yeah.
They
Any other questions? If you have any questions, please post it in your chat box, and then I can ask the panelists. Okay, I don't see any other questions, but several people have said it's a nice webinar, and we are getting a lot of positive comments, especially from our batchmates. Thank you very much for joining in and also for listening. Yes. Yes, now I see in the chat box that Dr. Vasana has said the participants should be able to join in now. Is that true? I don't know why. Vasana, it looks like it's not going to work. Okay. So in the absence of any other questions, can we see whether we can finish the webinar and then have our mini batch get together of 15 minutes? For that, we need to allow the participants to join in, please.
Sorry.
Shukri, I think you have to allow the participants to join in. Otherwise, they can't have the batch get together as well. Shukri, can you look into that, please?
Just a minute. I talk with Vipul sir. Just a minute.
No, no, stop. Okay,
So until he attends to it, thank you very much. I want to thank PEMSA for organizing this and letting us, our batch, get together like this. And then I also thank all the participants who joined in today. And I hope we will be able to have similar webinars in the future. Thank you very much. And please, batchmates of 87, 88 batch, please wait for a few minutes until we get this thing started.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, have a nice
Thank
time.
you, Tushara.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay, bye-bye.